March 12th, 1991. Sub Pop Records, Studio B. The clock read 9:47 p.m., and the air inside the cramped recording booth had grown thick with cigarette smoke and mounting frustration. Kurt Cobain sat in the corner with his borrowed Fender Mustang, watching Bruce Pavitt pace back and forth like a man running out of options. For the sixth time that evening, the lead singer of Mother Love Bone's replacement band had tried to nail the vocal for Negative Creep, and for the sixth time, his voice had cracked on the chorus. Bruce stopped pacing and looked at the young man in the vocal booth. "Eddie, your throat's shot. We need to call it." Kurt's fingers tightened around his guitar pick. He had been sitting in that same corner for 8 hours, playing rhythm parts for takes that never made it to completion. But something else had been happening during those 8 hours. While everyone focused on Eddie's failing voice, Kurt had been absorbing the song. Not just the chord progressions he was paid to play, but every melody line, every harmony, every pause between the screams. He knew he could sing it. The certainty sat in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. "Pack it up, everybody," Bruce announced to the room. "We'll try again tomorrow." The session musicians began unplugging their instruments. Stone Gossard gathered his sheet music with visible annoyance. Jeff Ament closed his bass case with more force than necessary. Another night, another incomplete recording. In the competitive world of 1991 Seattle grunge, incomplete recordings meant lost opportunities to labels like Caroline Records or even major labels circling the scene. But Kurt didn't move from his corner. He sat there staring at the empty microphone in the vocal booth, that weight in his chest growing heavier. 6 months earlier, Jonathan Poneman had walked him through these same doors with a simple introduction. "Bruce, meet Kurt, best session guitarist I know." That was it. No mention of the songs Kurt had written in his Olympia apartment. No mention of the vocals he'd recorded on his 4-track. No mention of the nights Kurt had stayed up until dawn, perfecting melodies that would never see the light of day. Jonathan had his reasons for the omission. At K Records, Kurt had been difficult to manage, too eager to contribute ideas, too quick to question arrangements. Jonathan needed someone reliable for Sub Pop sessions, not another aspiring frontman with opinions about the Seattle sound. Kurt had accepted the reduction in status because he needed the work. The transition from Olympia's indie scene to Seattle's emerging grunge movement meant steady pay, even if it meant sitting in the background while other people became the voice of a generation. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was learning the business from the inside. But those 6 months had been harder than he'd expected. Every morning he'd walked into Sub Pop knowing he had more to offer than anyone realized. Every evening he'd walked out having contributed nothing but solid rhythm work and reliable silence. The worst part wasn't the invisibility itself. It was watching other singers struggle with songs he knew he could handle better. He'd seen promising tracks ruined by performers who couldn't find the emotional center of the material. He'd watched Bruce grow frustrated with artists who had the technical skill, but lacked the instinctive understanding of what grunge was supposed to feel like. During breaks between sessions, while other musicians went outside to smoke or grab coffee, Kurt would stay with his guitar, quietly working through vocal arrangements in his head. He'd imagine how he would phrase certain lines, where he would add breath, where he would push the angst harder. But temporary had stretched into 6 months of watching, waiting, and keeping his mouth shut. 6 months of arriving early and staying late, observing how Bruce crafted the sub-pop sound, how bands like Soundgarden wrote hooks, how the magic happened in that cramped studio on Pine Street. 6 months of perfect timing, flawless rhythm work, and complete invisibility. The other musicians had started to see him as part of the furniture. Reliable Kurt, quiet Kurt, the guitarist who never complained, never missed a chord change, never caused problems. They liked him precisely because he made their lives easier by demanding nothing for himself. "You coming, Kurt?" Stone called from the doorway. "Yeah, just give me a minute." Stone shrugged and left. One by one, the others filed out until only Kurt and Bruce remained in the studio. Bruce was shuffling through papers at the mixing board, muttering about tomorrow's schedule. He seemed to have forgotten Kurt was still there. Kurt stood up from his corner. His legs felt unsteady, not from fatigue, but from the realization that this moment had been building for 6 months. Every night he'd gone home to his small apartment on Capitol Hill. He'd replayed the day's sessions in his mind. Every morning, he'd woken up with melodies in his head that he never shared. Every week that passed, the weight in his chest had grown heavier. Bruce! Bruce looked up from his papers, surprised. Oh, Kurt, thought you left already. Good work tonight as always. I want to try something. Bruce's expression shifted from casual friendliness to mild confusion. Try what? Kurt nodded toward the vocal booth. The song. I want to try singing it. The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an hour to Kurt. He watched Bruce's face process the request, saw the automatic no forming, then saw it pause as Bruce really looked at him for perhaps the first time since they'd been introduced. You sing? Bruce asked. I used to, before the session work. Jonathan never mentioned that. Jonathan had other priorities. Bruce leaned back in his chair, studying Kurt with the calculating gaze that had built Sub Pop from nothing into Seattle's most promising independent label. Everything about Bruce's success had come from recognizing the grunge sound before anyone else did. He'd heard something in Nirvana that other labels missed. He'd seen potential in Soundgarden when they were still struggling musicians from the University District. But he'd also learned to be suspicious of session musicians who harbored star ambitions. In 6 months, Bruce had formed a clear impression of Kurt Cobain. Reliable, professional, unambitious, the kind of musician who made everyone else's job easier by never complicating the process. Bruce respected that quality, even if he didn't find it particularly interesting. But something in Kurt's voice tonight had been different. All right, Bruce said finally, but just once. I don't have time for ego trips tonight. Kurt walked to the vocal booth on unsteady legs. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone stand. Through the glass, he could see Bruce settling back into his chair with the weary expression of a man humoring a child. This was it, the moment that would either validate 6 months of silent observation or confirm his place as background support for other people's dreams. He put on the headphones and heard his own breathing, amplified and suddenly too loud. The instrumental track began, and for the first 4 bars, Kurt just listened, feeling the familiar rhythm he'd played dozens of times that evening. Then he opened his mouth and began to sing. The first verse came out tentatively, almost conversational. He was feeling his way into the song, testing his voice against the arrangement, making sure everything fit. Through the glass, he could see Bruce's expression hadn't changed, still waiting to be impressed, still skeptical, but something was happening inside Kurt's chest. The weight that had been sitting there for 6 months was shifting, transforming into something else. Every word he sang felt like a small confession. Every note a piece of himself he'd been hiding. The melody felt like something he'd been carrying his whole life, waiting for the right moment to release it. As he sang, memories flooded through him. His father's disapproval of his musical ambitions. The years of playing in Olympia bands, feeling the power of his voice, but never being allowed to use it fully. The nights at K Records when Calvin Johnson would give the lead vocals to other singers, while Kurt provided guitar support. When the chorus arrived, his voice opened up completely. Not the polished, professional sound of the established Seattle bands, but something rawer, more vulnerable. There was pain in it, yes, but also hope. There was longing, but also determination. Each word carried the weight of 6 months of silence, 6 months of watching other people become the voice of his generation. Bruce straightened in his chair. Through the glass, Kurt could see the change in his posture, the way he leaned forward slightly. But Kurt couldn't stop now, couldn't let himself be distracted by Bruce's reaction. The second verse found Kurt settling deeper into the song, his voice gaining confidence with each line. He began to add small embellishments, tiny variations that made the familiar melody feel completely fresh. His left hand moved unconsciously, conducting an invisible orchestra, while his right hand gripped the microphone stand. He thought about Eddie struggling with the same song just hours earlier. Eddie's voice had been technically superior, more trained, more polished, but he hadn't been able to find the heart of the song. Kurt found that place instinctively, not through technique, but through recognition. Bruce was quiet for a long time, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. In the world of early 1990s grunge, discovering a new talent wasn't just about finding a good voice. It was about finding someone who could carry the emotional weight of the music, who could make people believe in the stories being told. What Bruce had just heard wasn't technically perfect. Kurt's voice still needed training, still needed the polish that would come with experience. But the essential ingredient was there, the ability to transform pain into beauty, to make vulnerability sound like strength. The silence stretched between them. Kurt could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, the distant hum of the Marshall stacks cooling down, the faint sound of traffic on Pine Street. This was the moment everything would change, or everything would remain exactly the same. Bruce walked to the control room window and pressed his palms against the glass, staring into the vocal booth as if he could see the ghost of what had just happened. "That wasn't just singing," he said finally. "That was something else entirely." Kurt remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had just been cast. He'd performed hundreds of times in Olympia, in small clubs, in friends' basements, but nothing had ever felt like this. It wasn't just that Bruce had heard him, it was that Kurt had finally heard himself. "You know what the difference is between what Eddie was doing and what you just did?" Bruce asked, turning back toward Kurt. "Eddie was trying to sing the song. You were trying to survive it." The observation hit Kurt like a physical blow. That was exactly what it had felt like. Not performance, but survival. Not entertainment, but exorcism. "I've been sitting in rooms like this for 3 years," Bruce continued, "listening to singers try to capture whatever it is that makes grunge matter. They understand the sound, they get the attitude, but they miss the core of it, the desperation. You can't fake that, Kurt. You either have it or you don't." Kurt's throat felt raw, not from the singing, but from the emotion still sitting there. "I never thought of it as desperation. What did you think of it as?" Kurt considered the question. "Honesty, I guess, like what happens when you stop pretending everything's fine?" Bruce nodded slowly. "That's what I heard. 3 minutes of someone refusing to pretend." The weight in Kurt's chest was shifting again, transforming from the familiar pressure of unexpressed creativity into something new and unfamiliar. Recognition, validation, the terrifying possibility that his voice might actually matter to someone other than himself. "Can you do it again?" Bruce asked. This time when Kurt sang, Bruce recorded it. The tape that was made that night would become the foundation for Kurt Cobain's first solo contract with Sub Pop. Bruce spent the next week playing the recording for other executives, for bands like Mudhoney and Tad, for anyone whose opinion mattered in the Seattle scene. Each person who heard it had the same reaction: shock followed by recognition, followed by the question of how they'd missed this talent for 6 months. The other session musicians had mixed reactions to Kurt's sudden elevation. Some were genuinely happy for him. Others felt envious, as if Kurt had been playing a game they didn't know existed. Within 6 months, Kurt would release Love Buzz, his debut single. Within a year, he would be touring as a headliner. But success, when it came, felt different than Kurt had imagined. The recognition he'd craved turned out to carry its own weight, its own complications. The spotlight that had seemed so appealing from behind the guitar became a pressure he wasn't fully prepared for. More troubling was the way success changed his relationship with music itself. During those months as a session player, music had been pure desire, the thing he wanted most but couldn't have. Once he had it, the simplicity of that desire became complicated by expectations, by business considerations, by the responsibility of representing a generation's anger and confusion. The quiet session guitarist who had grabbed the microphone that March night had wanted nothing more than the chance to sing. He'd achieved that goal entirely, but achieving it meant discovering that being heard was only the beginning of a much longer, more complex journey. Sometimes in his dressing room after concerts in later years, when the applause had faded and the crowds had gone home, Kurt would remember the purity of that moment in the studio. The pure clarity of wanting something simple, to be allowed to use his voice, before the complications of fame and success, before the weight of expectations, before the realization that being heard meant never being able to disappear again. That night in 1991, he had stepped forward and claimed his voice. Everything that followed, both the triumph and the eventual tragedy that would consume him, grew from that defining moment of courage. The transformation was completely and utterly irreversible.